Welcome to High Scary Stories. Tonight, we venture deep into the forgotten corners of the wilderness where maps fade, logic breaks, and things older than memory still whisper through the trees. These are not legends, not tall tales. They are real stories told by those who survived and still wonder if something followed them home. This is High Scary Stories. Let's begin. Story 1. The Hunter Who Didn't Blink. I was 11 when my dad decided it was time for me to become a real woodsman. That was the word he used. Woodsman, like something out of an old hunting manual from the 60s. He said every man in our family had spent time in the wilderness alone by that age, and he wasn't about to let me be the exception. So that summer we drove up to a remote stretch of forest in northwestern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. No cell towers, no marked trails, just a family cabin built by my great-grandfather, and a promise that I'd come back different. I remember the road to get there, narrow, winding, with trees leaning so close they scraped the sides of the truck. The place was surrounded by endless pine and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. It wasn't the cozy type of cabin you see in movies. It was old and heavy logs, dark with age, and a porch that sagged like it was tired of holding itself up. But Dad looked at it like it was sacred, a proving ground. Mom didn't come with us. She gave me a long hug in the driveway before we left and whispered something I didn't fully understand at the time. She said, "If anything feels wrong, you listen to your gut." Promise me. I promised. I wish I'd asked her why. The first 2 days were uneventful, almost boring. We spent the mornings fishing in the cold stream that curled behind the cabin, and the afternoons hiking game trails that wound through the brush like veins. Dad was in his element. He showed me how to spot deer tracks, how to listen for bird silence, how to stay still long enough for the woods to forget you were there. The nights were harder. The cabin didn't have electricity, just a wood stove and a few old oil lamps. Once the fire died down, the darkness felt thick. I'd lie in my bunk listening to the creaks of the woods settling, trying to ignore the way the trees scraped softly against the walls when the wind picked up. On the third night, I woke up needing to pee. The bathroom was technically an outhouse, about 20 feet behind the cabin. I didn't want to wake Dad, so I grabbed the flashlight and slipped outside quietly. The cold hit me first, and then the silence. Not even the usual night bugs were making noise. As I stepped off the porch, I saw something at the tree line. A figure, tall, motionless, standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. My heart jolted. I flicked the light toward it, but by the time the beam hit the trees, there was nothing. Just bark and branches and empty space. I stood there a moment, frozen, unsure if I had really seen someone. Then I heard a branch snap off to the left. Not loud, just enough. I turned and hurried to the outhouse, my breath sharp in the air. I didn't tell Dad in the morning. I figured maybe I imagined it. But part of me was already starting to feel watched. The feeling didn't go away the next day. If anything, it got worse. We hiked a ridge that morning, a narrow path that overlooked a drop so steep it made my stomach tighten every time I looked down. Dad was pointing out fresh scat and talking about elk behavior, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd catch someone following us. At one point, I swore I saw movement down in the trees, a flicker of something pale between the trunks, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't say anything. I didn't want him to think I was scared. That afternoon, we returned to the cabin to chop firewood. I was stacking the pieces against the wall when I noticed something strange on the ground just past the porch. A single boot print in the dirt. Not Dad's. Too small. Not mine either. And it was fresh. Clear tread. I looked around, trying to spot another, but there was just the one. Like someone had taken one step and vanished. I called for Dad, but when he came over, the print was gone, covered with leaves. I swore it had been there, but he just raised an eyebrow and told me maybe I was tired. That night, the wind picked up hard. The trees groaned and the cabin creaked like it was being pushed from all sides. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow, crunching pine needles, right outside my window. I froze, eyes wide, barely breathing. The steps stopped, then resumed, this time dragging, like someone limping. I sat up and peeked through the curtain. For a second, I saw it. A man, standing there, facing the cabin face, shadowed by the angle. But the thing that locked me in place was his eyes. He didn't blink, just stared unmoving. I blinked once, and he was gone. No footsteps away. Just gone. I didn't sleep at all after that. And in the morning, there were 2 boot prints by the window. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe the wind played tricks on my eyes. Maybe the prints were old and just uncovered by the storm. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. I knew what I saw. The next evening, Dad decided we'd hunt separately for a few hours before sundown to see if we could track anything. He said it was part of learning to move quietly, to be alone with the forest. He handed me the old hunting knife and told me to stick to the lower path and meet him back by the cabin before it got dark. I didn't want to go, but I nodded. I walked in silence for a while, trying to focus on the sounds around me, birds calling, wind in the branches. But then the woods went quiet. Not gradually, not naturally. One moment there was sound, and then there wasn't. That's when I heard it again. The dragging step. It was behind me. I turned, scanning the trail, but there was nothing there. I picked up my pace, heart pounding. The steps got closer. I broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't stop. I could feel him behind me. Not running, just walking, but somehow keeping up. I burst into the clearing behind the cabin just as the last light was fading. I spun around, a knife trembling in my hand, and he was there, 20 feet away, standing at the edge of the trees. Same stillness, same stare. No blinking, closer now. I could see his face, more clearly, pale, weathered eyes, too wide. His mouth opened like he was about to speak, but no sound came out. Then he raised his hand slowly, not in a wave, but pointing. Not at me, at the cabin. Behind me. I turned fast. Nothing there. But when I looked back, he was gone again. No sound. No movement. Just trees. I collapsed to my knees, breathing hard, knife still clenched in my fist. And I knew then he wasn't just watching. He wanted something. I didn't tell Dad what I saw. Not that night. Not the next morning either. I wanted to. I even tried once, but the words felt ridiculous in my mouth. I kept thinking maybe he'd laugh, or worse, maybe he'd look disappointed. So instead, I said nothing and followed him back into the woods like everything was fine. But it wasn't. That night, something changed. The air felt thicker, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of tapping. Not random, not wind. It was rhythmic. 3 taps. Pause. 3 more. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin. I lay frozen, listening. Then it moved. The tapping shifted from one wall to the next, circling us, like whoever it was mapping the cabin from the outside. Dad stirred, muttered something in his sleep, but didn't wake. Then came the sound of the front door creaking. Not opening. Just pressure against it, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the hinges. I slid out of bed and grabbed the knife heart, hammering. The door held. Silence followed. Then came the whisper. Just one word spoken low and breathy right outside my window. My name. No other sound. Just my name, like it had been waiting all this time to say it. I bolted. I ran barefoot through the front door into the trees, didn't even think. Just ran. The woods swallowed me whole. Branches clawed at my skin. My breath tore in and out of my lungs. I didn't stop until I hit the stream, slipped, and fell hard against the rocks. Everything went black. When I came to, the sun was up. I was alone. But on the rock beside me, carved deep into the stone, was a single word. My name. They found me just before noon, curled against the stream bank, half conscious and shivering. Dad carried me back to the cabin without asking a single question. Not that day. Not ever. He must have seen something in my face, because after we packed up and left the next morning, he never mentioned the cabin again. We never returned. On the drive home, he kept glancing at me like he wanted to speak, but all he said was, "Sometimes the woods give you answers you didn't ask for." I didn't reply. I didn't know how. For years after that trip, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything. That fear makes the mind play cruel tricks, especially on a kid. But I never forgot the way he looked, the way he never blinked, the way he said my name like he owned it. And then last winter, while helping Mom clear out the garage, I found an old photo in a cracked wooden box, black and white, curled at the corners. It was Dad as a teenager standing in front of the same cabin. Beside him stood a man in hunting gear, pale, still. Same stare, same eyes. No name written on the back, just a faded date, October 1967. I asked Mom who it was. She looked at the picture for a long time, then quietly said, "That's your grandfather's hunting guide? He disappeared that fall?" I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept well since. Story 2. Echoes from the trail camera. I had always preferred hiking in the off-season. No crowds, no noise, no overpacked trailheads. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my own boots on frozen ground. That January, I decided to take a solo trip up into the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I had 3 days off, and the weather forecast said cold but dry, which was perfect. My plan was simple. Hike in about 8 miles along an old logging route, set up camp by a ridge line, and spend the weekend tracking wildlife and collecting trail cam footage for my nature blog. I had done this kind of trip before, but never in winter. That made it feel different. Sharper somehow, like the silence had more weight. I brought the essentials. Tent, thermal bag, dehydrated meals, coffee of course, and 2 trail cameras. One would go facing the ridge trail, the other tucked into a grove near a game trail I had scouted online. I told a co-worker where I was going and dropped my route plan at the ranger station out of habit. No phone signal where I was headed. That was part of the point. I wanted quiet. Stillness. Something real. The kind of stillness that clears your head. And for the first day, it was exactly that. Long shadows, crisp wind, and the sound of nothing but nature stretching for miles. But that night, the first camera triggered. And what it captured still makes my hands shake. The first night was colder than expected. I had set up camp just below the ridgeline, where the wind cut sharper and the trees thinned out. I boiled water for my meal, set the cameras to motion capture, and climbed into my sleeping bag by 8. Everything felt normal at first. The woods made their usual night sounds. Wind through branches, a few distant owl calls. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. No dream, no sound, just wide awake, with my breath fogging in the air. I unzipped the bag, sat up and listened. Nothing. The kind of stillness that feels forced. Then I heard a click. soft, mechanical, almost delicate. I recognized it immediately. One of the trail cameras had triggered. I waited for movement or sound, but there was nothing. Just the click and then silence. In the morning, I made coffee with shaking hands, more from the cold than anything else, and checked the cameras. The one on the game trail had 2 clips. The first was just wind moving low branches, but the second was strange. It was only 4 seconds long. The footage showed something passing between 2 trees, but it was too fast, too close to the lens. No clear shape, no body, just a blur. A white streak and then blackness. No timestamp glitch, no audio. The camera had cut off mid-frame. I told myself it was just a deer too close to the sensor. But something about the angle didn't make sense. The camera was mounted 5 feet up and aimed down the trail. Whatever passed had moved across the top half of the frame like it was walking upright. Taller than me. I didn't say it aloud, but something felt off. I left the camera where it was and tried to shake the feeling. Maybe I had angled it wrong. Maybe light caught it weird. I hiked deeper into the forest that day, following an old elk trail marked by scat and rubbed bark. The sun was low by mid-afternoon, and the cold settled into my boots like ice. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I heard anything, but because I felt something. The kind of pressure that builds in your chest like someone is standing just behind you, breathing slow and steady. I didn't see anything unusual, though. No tracks, no broken brush, just woods. When I returned to camp around 4, I noticed something strange. My other trail camera, the one I had strapped to a tree just beyond the fire pit, was missing. Gone. The strap was still there, dangling empty, like it had been unbuckled, not torn. I stood there a long time, scanning the trees. My pack hadn't been touched. Nothing else was missing. I found the camera half an hour later, about 20 yards from the tree, lying face up in the snow. The lens was cracked and the body dented like it had been dropped from a height. But what chilled me wasn't the damage. It was what was carved into the snow beside it. A spiral. Precise, clean, maybe 8 inches wide. No boot prints, no drag marks, just the spiral in untouched snow. I took a photo and brushed it away. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 1 a.m, I heard footsteps outside the tent. Not crunching like a bear or a deer. They were deliberate, slow, human. I held my breath and waited for them to pass, but they didn't. They circled, once then again, closer each time. I gripped my knife and whispered my own name like it might keep me anchored. The steps stopped just behind my head. And then came a whisper so soft, I thought I imagined it. Hello. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Every muscle in my body locked as that single word echoed in my skull. Hello. The voice had been low and too close, like someone kneeling right behind the tent wall, close enough to touch the nylon with their breath. I waited, knife in hand, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Nothing else followed. No retreating steps, no rustle of fabric, just silence. Not even wind. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I finally worked up the nerve to sit up slowly, keeping the blade close. I flicked on my headlamp and aimed it at the tent wall. No shadows, no shapes. I whispered, "Who's there?" Nothing. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped into the snow. My boots crunched loud in the stillness. The moon was out, throwing pale light across the trees. The forest looked empty clean, but I knew it wasn't. Then I saw it. On the tree directly facing my tent, something was nailed into the bark. My trail camera, the one I had found broken earlier, now hanging at head height, lens cracked, but power light blinking. I approached slowly, stomach churning. I reached out and pressed the playback button. Only one video file. I watched it on the tiny screen. The footage showed me, sleeping, in the tent, from just a few feet away. I saw myself roll over, adjust my sleeping bag. The timestamp said it was recorded less than 2 hours ago. But no one else was in the frame. No footsteps, no approach, just the camera being still. Until the final second. That's when a face entered the edge of the frame. Pale, eyeless, grinning too wide. Just staring at me. And then the screen went black. I dropped the camera. Not threw it, just let it fall like my fingers no longer wanted to be a part of what they were holding. My breath came short and shallow, and for a moment I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of blood in my ears. I backed away from the tree, keeping my eyes on the woods, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. No wind, no rustling, not even the distant creak of snow shifting. The forest was frozen in place, like it was holding its breath with me. I grabbed my pack, not even bothering to roll up the tent. I just stuffed what I could inside and started down the trail with only my headlamp to cut through the dark. I didn't care about gear. I didn't care about footprints or direction. I just wanted out. I moved fast, half stumbling, slipping on frozen ground tree branches, slapping across my arms and face. I didn't look back, not once. But I heard it, behind me. Heavy steps, not close, but steady. Not trying to hide, just following. I made it to the old logging road by first light legs, shaken throat raw from breathing frozen air. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried. I slammed the door, locked it, and didn't look up until I was halfway back to town. And that night, after a long shower and 2 hours of trying to sleep, my phone buzzed. No signal all day, but suddenly it lit up with one new file. An airdrop request, no name, just a preview image, a still frame of me, asleep, in the tent, taken from just inches away. I didn't accept it. I turned the phone off, but the image was already burned into my memory. I never went back to that trail. I told the ranger station I had finished early due to weather and left it at that. They didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any. For weeks after, I kept checking my phone even though it stayed powered off most nights. I changed the locks on my apartment, bought blackout curtains, even moved my bed away from the window, but it didn't help. I kept seeing that face from the trail camera every time I closed my eyes. It wasn't the grin that haunted me most. It was the stillness. The way it stared like it had all the time in the world. Sometimes I think about that moment, the one where I saw myself sleeping. Think about how close that thing had to be. How long it must have watched. And worst of all, how I never heard it. I deleted everything. The photos, the footage, even my backup drives. But one night about a month later, a friend tagged me in a random wildlife post on social media. It was from a private account I didn't recognize. A photo of a snowy ridge. In the background, barely visible between two trees, was a blurry figure. Too tall. Too still. And underneath it, in the caption, just one word: watching. I didn't like it. I didn't comment. I just blocked the account. But ever since, I've had the feeling that the trail didn't stay in the forest. Some part of it followed me back, and it's still watching. Story 3. Campsite 12 never existed. I had been planning the trip for months. A long solo hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains in late October, right before the first snow. I needed the break. Work had been draining, and I was tired of staring at the same screens and drinking the same burnt coffee every day. The trail I picked was part of an old ranger-maintained loop rarely used now, except by the occasional backpacker. I downloaded offline maps marked key water sources and highlighted 2 backcountry campsites. Campsite 9 for the first night and Campsite 12 for the second. I found it listed in a scanned copy of a park maintenance report from 5 years ago, tucked away on a forum for long-distance hikers. There was no mention of it on the current park website, but I figured it was just an oversight. The first day on the trail was everything I needed. Cold wind, sharp sunlight, and not a single voice besides my own. I made it to Campsite 9 by late afternoon. It was a flat, shaded clearing near a slow creek. I set up my tent, boiled water for dinner, and watched the sun fade behind the ridgeline. I slept deeply that night, in the kind of silence you only get miles from any road. The next morning, I packed up early, eager to reach Campsite 12 before sunset. I didn't realize until later that I had already left the map behind. Or maybe it had left me. The trail to Campsite 12 started off clearly enough. I followed orange blazes painted on tree trunks that looked fresh despite the trail being labeled unofficial on most maps. The forest here felt different. Not threatening exactly, just older. The kind of old where the trees grow too close together and the light filters down in pieces. Around noon, I reached a fork that wasn't on any of my marked routes. The path to the left dipped toward a creek. The one on the right climbed gently into thicker woods. Neither had blazes. I checked my phone again, but the GPS was struggling. The dot hovered uncertainly between both paths, like it couldn't decide where I was. I took the right trail, figuring elevation meant clearer views and hopefully a familiar landmark. But the higher I climbed, the less familiar everything became. The trees didn't change. The rocks all looked the same. I passed a fallen birch 3 times, or maybe 3 different birches. I told myself I was just tired. I kept walking. It wasn't until I found the campsite marker that things really turned. A weathered wooden post driven into the earth with the number 12 burned into it. No fire ring, no cleared tent pad, no signs anyone had ever camped there. Just a flat patch of earth and a strange silence pressing in from the trees. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I dropped my pack and stood there staring at the marker. I should have felt relieved, but something in my chest tightened instead. I took 1 step forward, and the air felt heavier, like I was stepping into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I turned, slowly scanning the trees. That was when I noticed it. A second marker, identical. Less than 20 feet away, also marked 12. I walked toward the second marker, expecting maybe a broken sign or some old ranger's error, but as I got closer, the feeling deepened. The number 12 had been burned into the wood, with the same lettering, same placement, even the same angle in the dirt. It wasn't a mistake. It was a copy. My eyes scanned the area and caught another one. Further off to the right, half concealed behind a fallen log, another 12. I stood perfectly still. My breath was visible in the cooling air, even though the sun still hung above the trees. 3 identical campsite markers, none of them surrounded by signs of use. No ashes, no trampled ground, no worn footpath. Just still air, and those markers like someone had planted them for me to find. I backed away slowly and chose the original one. The first 12 I saw. I needed to believe it was real. I set up my tent with shaky hands, constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built a small fire, more for comfort than heat. I kept it close and low, as if trying not to draw attention. But the woods were too quiet. No crack of branches under deer hooves. No distant owl calls. Just the soft crackle of my fire and the occasional rustle of wind through leaves that somehow never touched my tent. I checked my map again by firelight, the printed version I had tucked in my pack. It still listed campsite 12, but the location marked was over 3 miles from where I stood. I had hiked barely half that. I ran my finger along the trail and noticed something else. The path I followed wasn't there, not even as an old branch. It didn't exist on paper. I turned off the fire just before midnight, sat inside my tent and listened. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt crowded, like something was out there, holding its breath and waiting for me to do the same. At some point in the night, I must have fallen asleep because I woke with a start to the sound of footsteps just outside the tent. Not animal sounds, not skittering or four-legged pacing. These were slow, deliberate human footsteps. One step pause, another step. My body went rigid. I reached silently for the flashlight and clicked it on, but kept it pointed downward. The steps circled the tent, once then stopped directly in front of the entrance. I didn't dare breathe. I waited for a knock, a voice, a zipper pull. Nothing came, just silence again. Then something pressed lightly against the tent wall. Not a hand, not a full shape, just enough to bulge the fabric slightly. I bolted upright, flashlight shaking in my hand, and shouted, "Hey!" I unzipped the flap in one motion and shined the light outside. Nothing. No one. Just trees. Still no wind. I stepped out barefoot, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The forest around the campsite looked unchanged. But then I saw it. Another marker. Number 12. Now directly behind my tent. I know it hadn't been there before. I would have noticed. I spun around and now saw 2 more to the left and right. All identical. All evenly spaced, like points on a compass surrounding me. I turned in a slow circle, trying to stay calm, but every direction now led to a marker. The original path I took into the site was gone. Not overgrown. Gone. Like the trees had closed in while I slept. I stumbled back into the tent and zipped it shut, hands trembling. I checked my GPS. No signal. No satellite location. Just a blinking dot with no map under it. Then the footsteps returned. Closer this time. Heavier. And this time they didn't stop. They walked right up to the tent and a shadow fell across the thin nylon. Tall, narrow, still. I held the flashlight tightly in both hands as the figure leaned forward just enough for me to see the outline of a face. It was mine. But the eyes were empty. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat as the figure remained still outside the tent. I blinked once and it was gone. No footsteps, no rustle of movement. Just the shadow vanishing like it had never been there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. I scrambled out of the tent, not bothering with my boots, grabbing only my headlamp and the map. I ran toward where I thought the trail had been, dodging trees that felt like they had moved closer in the night. The forest had changed. Every direction looked the same. Every path led to more trees and more darkness. I ran until I hit a clearing that wasn't there before. Perfectly round, flattened as if something had pressed down from above. In the center stood one last campsite marker. 12, burned deeper than the others, the wood blackened around the edges. I backed away slowly and tripped on something soft. It was my pack, the one I had left back at the first marker, sitting upright in the clearing like someone had placed it there carefully. Inside was my phone still off and my map. Except now the paper was blank. No trails, no lines, just white. I turned to run and nearly collided with another figure. Again, it looked like me, but not right. Too tall, too still. Its mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. I bolted into the trees, pushing branches aside until I broke through to a dirt road I didn't recognize. Behind me, the forest stayed quiet. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I saw headlights in the distance. A truck slowed as I stumbled out barefoot and wild-eyed. The driver rolled down the window and said, "You coming from campsite 12?" His voice was steady, but his eyes didn't blink. The man didn't ask me any more questions. He just opened the passenger door and waited. I climbed in without a word. My feet were numb and my throat dry, but I didn't feel cold. I felt hollow, like something had been emptied out of me. We drove in silence for nearly 30 minutes until we reached a ranger station I didn't remember passing on the way in. It looked abandoned. Windows boarded up, weeds growing through the steps. But the man stopped the truck and gestured for me to get out. I hesitated. When I turned to ask who he was, the seat beside me was empty. The truck engine was running, door closed, but no driver. I stood alone in the gravel, watching the woods behind me. Nothing moved, no sound. Eventually, I found my way to a highway and hitchhiked back to town. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the park office. When I got home, I checked the official trail maps again. Campsite 12 wasn't listed. Never had been. I even found that old forum post I thought I had saved. Gone. Like it had never existed. Every once in a while, I still dream about the clearing, the identical markers, the sound of my own footsteps walking around my tent. But the worst part is not the dreams. It's that sometimes when I'm walking past a wooded area near my apartment, I see something nailed to a tree. A wooden post, faded, weather-worn, and on it, burned deep into the grain, is the number 12. Story 4. The Red Thread in the Cabin. My sister and I inherited the cabin after our grandfather passed. It was buried deep in the northern woods of Wisconsin, near a lake that didn't show up on any digital maps. Just a patch of water surrounded by trees that always seemed too quiet. Grandpa had built the place in the 60s by hand. No electricity, no plumbing, just a fireplace, a couple of cots, and a porch that creaked no matter how light you stepped. He used to spend summers out there fishing and reading old war novels. After the funeral, we decided to visit the cabin one last time before deciding whether to sell it. We wanted to see what was left inside and maybe say goodbye to a piece of our childhood. The drive took nearly 5 hours, and we had to hike the last mile since the dirt road had washed out. My sister Emma was quiet the whole way. She always had a strange connection to Grandpa. Said she dreamed about him a lot after he died, that he talked to her in the dreams, but never said anything she could remember. Just stood near the lake and pointed. When we finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, and the air had that sharp stillness that comes before frost. The door was unlocked. Not broken, not forced. Just quietly swinging open as if it had been waiting for us. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and something else. Something faintly metallic. And tied across the front door frame from one side to the other was a single strand of red thread. Pulled tight, unbroken. At first, we thought it was a prank. Maybe some local kids had found the cabin and decided to mess with it. The red thread looked new, clean, not weathered like everything else in the cabin. It stretched from one side of the doorway to the other, tied at eye level, perfectly straight. Emma ducked under it first and stepped inside. I hesitated, not sure why, but followed a moment later, The cabin was just as we remembered: dusty shelves, old fishing gear in the corner, and Grandpa's cot still pressed against the far wall. But something felt wrong. Not out of place, just off. The kind of wrong you feel before you know why. We unpacked our sleeping bags, made a small fire in the old stone hearth, and tried to settle in. But Emma kept glancing at the door. The red thread stayed taut in the frame, unmoved by breeze or firelight. That night, as we tried to sleep, I heard footsteps on the porch. Not animals. Slow, deliberate pacing, back and forth. I sat up, heart pounding, but Emma was already awake, eyes open in the dark. She whispered, "Do you hear it too?" I nodded. Neither of us moved. The footsteps stopped. Then something tapped the door. Once. Then again. Not loud. Like a single knuckle knocking with careful rhythm. We waited, breath shallow, until it stopped. In the morning, we checked the porch. No prints. No sign anyone had been there. But the red thread was gone, snapped clean in the middle. Both ends still tied to the frame, like someone had walked through it from the outside. Emma didn't say a word. She just stared at the broken thread, then walked to the lake without looking back. I followed Emma down the path to the lake, the morning air cold and damp. The trees were so still, they almost looked fake, like painted backdrops. When we reached the shoreline, she stood perfectly still, staring across the water. The lake was flat, smooth like glass, but something about its surface looked wrong. Too dark, too deep. I asked if she was okay. She didn't answer, just pointed across the lake the way Grandpa used to in her dreams. I turned to look, but saw nothing. Just more trees. We stayed there for a while in silence before heading back to the cabin. That afternoon, we found more red thread. A long piece tied between two trees about 30 feet behind the cabin. Then another strung low to the ground across the trail. All fresh, all pulled tight. We followed one of the strands deeper into the woods until it vanished high into a pine tree out of reach. That's when I found the bones. Small, clean, arranged in a perfect spiral in a bed of moss. Emma didn't react. She just knelt down beside them and whispered something I couldn't hear. That night we didn't sleep. The footsteps came back, circling the cabin in long, slow loops. I sat by the fire, gripping the poker like a weapon, but nothing ever knocked. Nothing ever opened the door. Around 3 in the morning, the red thread returned, stretched once again across the front door, tied tight, as if it had never been broken. I didn't hear anyone come in. I didn't see the door move. But when I stepped out at sunrise, the trail behind the cabin had changed. Where there had been dirt and roots, now ran a line of red thread, weaving between trees, vanishing into the forest. Like it wanted us to follow. Emma was already outside. She was barefoot, eyes wide, standing at the edge of the trail. She said one thing before stepping into the trees. He left it for us. I called out to Emma, but she didn't stop. Her bare feet moved silently across the cold earth as she followed the red thread deeper into the woods. I grabbed my boots and flashlight and ran after her, the morning still dim under the thick canopy. The thread wound tightly between trees, never touching the ground, always just high enough to guide, but not to trip. It felt deliberate, like it had been set for us long before we ever arrived. After 10 minutes of fast walking, the thread dipped into a hollow. There, in the center of a sunken clearing, stood something I hadn't seen in years, a wooden structure half rotted and choked with moss. It looked like an old well-house roof, collapsed stones warped with age. Emma stood in front of it, her arms limp at her sides. The thread ran directly into the black hole at the center where the well mouth gaped open. I stepped beside her and asked what she was doing. She said softly, "He's in there." I asked who. Her voice didn't change. "Grandpa. He never left." My skin went cold. I looked into the well but couldn't see the bottom. Just dark that pulsed faintly like breath. The thread dangled into it, disappearing into shadow. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint. Familiar. It said my name. Just once. But it sounded like him. Like Grandpa. I staggered back, heart hammering. Emma reached for the thread like she meant to climb down. I grabbed her hand and pulled her away hard. She fought me, eyes wide and angry, until I shouted her name. Then she stopped. Just stopped and blinked, like waking from a trance. We turned and ran. Didn't speak and didn't look back. The thread had vanished by the time we reached the cabin. Every strand, gone. But the front door was open again, and nailed into the frame where the thread had once been tied was a single old photograph. Our grandfather, young and smiling, standing beside that same well. His eyes scratched out. Emma stared at the photograph for a long time. Her face had gone pale, lips parted like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. I took it down from the frame carefully. The photo felt cold, damp, like it had just been pulled from water. On the back in faded pencil was a date from the 1960s and a single word written in shaky handwriting tether. We packed up in near silence, not even discussing whether we should stay another night. We both knew we wouldn't. The fire had burned low, and when I reached to stir the embers, I found another piece of red thread buried in the ash, charred at the ends, but still whole. That was the final push. We left the cabin just after noon, hiking fast despite the cold biting at our skin. But the woods didn't look the same. The trail we had taken in was unfamiliar. Landmarks were gone. Trees we remembered seemed taller, closer, wrong. I kept checking the compass, but the needle spun slightly every time I turned. We followed what we thought was the right path until Emma suddenly stopped. Her voice was thin, afraid. She pointed ahead. There, hanging from a low branch, was another red thread tied in a loop like a noose. Beneath it, in the snow, was another photograph. This time, it showed the two of us, in the clothes we were wearing right now, standing at the cabin porch. But we hadn't taken that picture. Emma didn't say a word. She just started to run. I followed her breath, burning the sound of something behind us, moving too fast to be human. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. Not until we saw the glint of my car through the trees. We didn't talk on the drive back. Emma sat curled in the passenger seat, staring out the window with the photograph clutched tight in her hand. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a thread stretched across the road or someone standing in the middle of the trees. But nothing followed us. Not that we could see. When we got back to the city, Emma stayed at my apartment for a few days. She barely spoke. Just walked from room to room like she was trying to remember how walls were supposed to feel. Eventually she went home. We never told anyone what happened. Not our parents, not our friends. We agreed to sell the cabin, but when we called the county records office, they had no listing for any property by the lake. No deed, no structure, no coordinates. It wasn't there. According to them, it never had been. Sometimes at night, I still find pieces of red thread, caught in the hinge of a closet door, wrapped once around the handle of my front gate. Always clean, always fresh. I don't touch them anymore. I don't try to follow. But Emma does. She's been going back to the woods alone. Says she dreams better when she's near the trees. Last week she sent me a picture. It was the lake. Same angle Grandpa used to take. And in the distance near the shoreline there was a figure, blurred, tall, with red thread wrapped tightly around both hands. Story 5. Whispers in the Birch Hollow. I took the forestry job because I needed space. After the divorce and losing my father within the same year, I wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one would ask me how I was doing or expect me to have an answer. The Department of Natural Resources offered a seasonal position maintaining trails in a protected state forest up north. It paid enough to cover rent back home, and it came with a cabin deep in the woods near a birch hollow that hadn't been logged in decades. The ranger who dropped me off mentioned the hollow like it was an afterthought. Said it was beautiful but strange. Trees grew too close together. Sound didn't travel right there. I didn't think much of it at the time. My days were simple. I hiked trails, cleared debris, made notes on fallen trees, and sometimes radioed in when I spotted deer or signs of black bears. The solitude felt like a relief. Nights were colder than expected, but I had a wood stove and enough canned food to last the season. The first week passed without much thought. The forest around the cabin was peaceful, birds always active, wind always moving. But the Birch Hollow was different. Every time I passed its edge, the air changed. It wasn't cold exactly, just still, like the rest of the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was just the trees, just the way they stood so close together. But then I started hearing things, small things, faint whispers, only when I was alone, only when I was near the hollow. At first, I chalked it up to the wind. The birch trees in the hollow were tall and narrow, and when the breeze moved through them, their white trunks creaked softly like old floorboards. But the more time I spent near that part of the forest, the more I realized what I was hearing wasn't the wind. It came when the air was still. No rustling leaves, no bird calls. Just quiet. And then the whispering. Faint, like someone speaking from a distance into their hand. I couldn't make out words, only the cadence. Soft, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was in my head, a byproduct of being alone too long. I even laughed about it once, while cutting branches off a fallen spruce near the hollow's edge. But the laughter died in my throat when I heard it again. Louder this time, closer, like someone standing just beyond the trees. I stood frozen axe in hand and called out. Hello, no answer, just silence. I walked a few paces toward the sound, but it vanished the second I moved. Later that night, back at the cabin, I was reading when I heard something strange above the stove's quiet crackling. A new sound, a soft thump against the back wall, then another, like something tapping gently from outside. I stepped to the door and opened it, shining my flashlight across the clearing. Nothing, just trees swaying, the same white bark of the birches catching the light. I turned to go back inside and paused. There on the ground, near the steps, was a strip of bark. Birch bark, curled slightly at the edges. On its inner side, someone had scratched a single word with a sharp point. Listen. I didn't sleep much that night. The bark strip sat on the table beside my bed, and the word carved into it as clear as if someone had just scratched it in. I tried to convince myself it was left over from some hiker or kid who had camped out here before. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been there earlier, and it wasn't old. The cut marks were fresh, sharp, like whatever had made them hadn't bothered to hide it. The next day, I avoided the Birch Hollow entirely, took the long loop around the ridge, kept my eyes on the trail. But even away from the grove, something felt wrong. The birds were quiet. The air felt thick, like the forest was listening. That afternoon, when I returned to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I never leave it open. Not out here. Not out. I stepped inside, slowly checking the corners, but nothing was out of place. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved. Except for one thing. On my bed was another strip of bark, this one longer. It had 2 words this time. You heard? I didn't touch it. I packed a bag right then and decided I'd report the incident at the ranger station in the morning. Just one more night, I told myself. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the knob, kept the light on. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to whispering again. Not outside. Inside. Faint and steady, like someone talking through the walls. I stood and pressed my ear against the boards. The whispering stopped. Then came the sound of paper sliding. I looked down. Another strip of bark had been pushed under the door. I bent to pick it up, hands shaking. This one didn't have words. It had a drawing. A figure standing in the birch grove, alone, with something behind it, tall, shadowed, and watching. I stared at the drawing for a long time. The figure in the grove looked like me. Same height, same stance, same ranger uniform. The thing behind it was harder to make out its shape, stretched unnaturally tall with long arms that reached the ground and a head that tilted slightly, as if listening. I dropped the bark and backed away from the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just sat with my flashlight on, watching the window and flinching at every sound in the woods. At sunrise, I left the cabin without packing, walking fast toward the ranger station 3 miles out. But as I passed the Birch Hollow, I stopped. The trees were swaying gently, though there was no wind. And in the center of the grove, someone stood motionless. Not walking, not calling out. Just standing there facing away from me. I should have kept walking. Every instinct told me to leave. But something pulled me forward. I stepped off the trail and entered the hollow. The air changed instantly. Thicker. Quiet. The world muffled like I was underwater. I called out. No answer. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and the smell hit me, damp earth and rot. The figure turned. It was me, or something wearing my face. But the eyes were wrong. Too black, too deep. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Only whispering from the trees around us, rising and rising until I dropped to my knees and covered my ears. The figure took one step toward me, then another. I scrambled backward, breaking from the circle of birch and gasping for breath as the whispers cut off all at once. When I looked back, and the grove was empty. No figure, no sound, just the same pale trees swaying, and at their base, another strip of bark fluttering in the wind. This time it said only one word. Stay. I ran. Branches whipped across my face as I pushed through the undergrowth, not caring where the trail was anymore. I just needed distance. I could still hear the whispering, not from behind me, but inside my ears like it had sunk beneath my skin. I didn't stop until I saw the metal roof of the old fire watch cabin through the trees. Not my station, not on any map I remembered. But I ran toward it anyway. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and dry, like no one had breathed it in years. There was no furniture, just dust and a cracked mirror on the far wall. I leaned against it to catch my breath, my reflection staring back, wide-eyed and pale. Then something moved behind me. In the mirror, a figure, just out of frame. I spun around. Nothing. When I looked again, my reflection was no longer mine. It wore my face, but stood too still. Its mouth opened, and though the room remained silent, I heard the word again, deep inside my chest. Stay. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me. The whispering grew louder, rising and falling like breath in the trees. The forest blurred past until I saw the ranger station ahead. Real this time. I crashed through the door and collapsed to the floor. The whispering stopped instantly. Just silence. Familiar, normal. One of the rangers found me there hours later, shaking. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. When they went to search the Birch Hollow, they found no bark strips, no cabin, just trees. Rows of perfect white birches, all swaying gently in wind that no one could feel. They told me I had been out there longer than I thought, that I missed 2 scheduled radio check-ins and was listed as unresponsive for nearly 48 hours. I don't remember losing time. I remember everything. Every sound, every whisper, every detail of the thing that wore my face. They let me go home early after a psychological evaluation. Stress, they said. Isolation. Too much time alone in the woods. I nodded and agreed because it was easier than telling the truth. That something in the Birch Hollow watches, listens, mimics. I threw away my ranger uniform, moved back to the city, got a job where the only trees I see are in parking lot medians. But I still hear it sometimes, at night when it's quiet. A faint voice saying my name, always just once, always from behind. I don't turn around anymore. I keep my mirrors covered. I stopped answering phone calls from unknown numbers. I don't hike. I don't go near the woods. But a few days ago, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single strip of birch bark. Blank, clean, and yet somehow fresh. I burned it in the sink and watched the smoke curl upward like breath. It smelled like wet soil and firewood. And as the flame died out, I heard something faint behind me. A whisper, as if the hollow was reminding me that it remembers too. Story 6. The Man in the Hardware Store. I started working at the hardware store after my uncle had a stroke. It was a small place on the edge of a dying town, the kind of store that still sold nails by the pound and kept spare keys hanging from the ceiling on labeled hooks. My uncle had run it since the 70s, and after the hospital admitted him, my aunt asked me to help out. I just finished school and didn't have anywhere else to be, so I said yes. The town was quiet. Too quiet. A mix of retired farmers and folks who never left. Most of the regulars kept to themselves, bought what they needed, nodded politely, and left. The building was old. Wood floors that creaked when it was humid, dim yellow lights overhead, and a back room filled with things even my uncle had forgotten about. I didn't mind the work. There was something comforting about the routine. Each morning I swept the front walk, flipped the open sign, and waited. On the 3rd week, just before closing, a man walked in I had never seen before. Tall, thin, wearing a green flannel jacket despite the summer heat. He didn't browse, just walked directly to the counter and placed a small brass key on top. He didn't say a word, just looked at me and waited. His eyes were pale, too pale, like glass. I asked if he needed something copied. He nodded once, then smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. I took the key and turned toward the machine in the corner. The brass was cold, colder than it should have been, like it had just come from a freezer. As I clamped it into place, I glanced back at the man. He hadn't moved, just stood perfectly still at the counter, hands resting flat, eyes fixed on me. Most customers looked around or fidgeted. He didn't blink. The key itself was strange. No number stamped on it, no manufacturer mark. Just smooth metal and a long shaft with an unusual cut, almost like it wasn't made for any door I'd seen before. I ran the duplication anyway, sparks flying as the blade shaped the blank to match. When I finished, I handed the original and the copy back. The man took both without a word. He didn't pay, didn't ask how much, just gave a slow nod and walked out. The bell above the door didn't ring. I waited a few seconds, then stepped outside to see which direction he'd gone. But the sidewalk was empty. No footsteps, no one walking. The street was still. I shrugged it off and went back inside. I told myself he must have moved fast or maybe turned the corner. But that night, when I locked up and turned off the lights, I noticed something odd. The key duplicator was still warm, not just warm hot like it had been running again. I checked the counter. Another key was there, identical. Brass, cold to the touch. But I hadn't made it. I stood there for a long time just staring at the key. I knew I hadn't made another one. I had shut the machine off, swept the shavings, and locked up like I always did. But there it was, same strange cuts, same smooth brass, no markings. I put it in a drawer under the counter and told myself I'd ask my uncle about it when he was well enough. Maybe there was some trick to the duplicator I didn't know. But the next morning when I came in to open the shop, there was another key. This one was already in the machine. The blank was still warm, like it had just been cut, the edges smooth and sharp. No one had been in the store. I checked the security camera above the register. The screen was black. Not just off, dead. I checked the footage on the small backroom monitor. Nothing. Just static where the recording should have been. That day, I kept the doors locked and the lights on full. I couldn't focus. Every creak in the floor sounded like footsteps. Every shadow in the back room made me stop what I was doing and stare. That evening, just before sunset, the man returned. Same jacket, same pale eyes. This time he carried nothing. He walked straight to the counter and placed a piece of paper down. It was yellowed, stained, folded neatly in half. I picked it up and opened it. A hand-drawn map. But it wasn't the town. It was the store. Every room, every wall, even the storage area out back. And one thing circled in red ink, a door I had never seen before. A door behind the shelving in the far corner. I looked up to ask him what it meant, but he was already gone. The door had never been there. Not in the blueprints, not in memory. But when I pushed the shelf aside, the wall behind it was different. Older. And in the center was a door made of dark wood, with a lock that looked like it fit the key exactly. I stared at the door for what felt like hours. The wood was darker than the walls around it, old and uneven, as if it had been cut by hand long before the rest of the store was built. There was no doorknob, just a keyhole. I reached into the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out the strange brass key. It felt heavier now, warmer, like it wanted to be used. My heart was pounding as I stepped forward. I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The moment it clicked, the store lights flickered, then the air shifted. I could feel it like pressure changing before a storm. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed harder than fear. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. Behind it was a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The walls were stone damp and rough. The air smelled like soil and rust. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and stepped inside. Each stair creaked under my weight, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence below. When I reached the bottom, I found a single-room square and windowless, with shelves lining the walls. Every shelf was filled with keys, hundreds of them, each labeled with tags that had no names, only dates. Some from decades ago, some from the future. In the center of the room stood a workbench, and at the workbench, hunched over a duplicator identical to the one upstairs, sat the man. Same flannel jacket, same pale eyes. He looked up slowly and smiled. But this time he spoke. "Welcome back. We've been waiting." His voice was mine, not similar, identical. And as he turned, I saw the back of his neck. The skin there was stitched, like someone had sewn him together, or remade him. He held out another key. This one was marked with tomorrow's date. My name was scratched faintly into the tag. I stepped back instinctively, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The man, or the thing wearing my face, stood slowly holding out the key like it was a gift I had asked for. I didn't move to take it. I couldn't. My legs felt locked in place, like the air itself had thickened around me. He tilted his head slightly, confused, then disappointed. "You're not ready," he said, still in my voice. Then he placed the key on the workbench and turned away. That was when the whispering began. Not from him, but from the walls. A low chorus, voices overlapping, rising in volume like a wave about to break. I turned and ran. Up the stairs, 2 at a time, my boots echoing off the stone. Behind me, the light began to pulse. With every flash, I saw things in the shadows. Shapes, moving, reaching. I burst through the door and slammed it shut. The whispering cut off instantly. Silence fell over the shop. I locked the door, shoved the shelf back into place, and stepped away, heart racing. When I turned, the store looked different. Brighter. The floor was clean, the shelves full. My uncle was standing behind the counter, healthy, smiling. I blinked. Then he was gone. The shop returned to how it had been, dusty, dim, empty. I checked the shelf again. No door, no seam, no sign it had ever been there. But the key was still in my pocket, still warm, still waiting. I left the store that night and didn't return for days. I told my aunt I was sick. She didn't question it, just said the store had been quiet anyway. I kept the key in a drawer beside my bed, wrapped in an old dishcloth, but no matter how many times I checked it, never cooled. It stayed warm like a living thing. I tried to throw it away once, but when I woke the next morning, it was back in the drawer. The tag with my name had darkened, the letters deeper, almost burned into the metal. I stopped sleeping well. My dreams were filled with the hum of the duplicator, the soft clink of brass hitting stone. Sometimes I would wake and find keys on my windowsill perfectly copied, unlabeled, waiting. I went back to the shop eventually, if only to feel normal again. But everything felt thinner, like the world inside that building wasn't quite the same as the one outside. The door in the back corner never returned. Not visibly. But sometimes when I walked too close to the shelf, I would hear a faint click like a lock turning on the other side. The duplicator still works fine, but I don't use it unless I have to. And when I do, I make sure to unplug it the second I'm done. I don't know who he was, or what that place beneath the store really is. But I know one thing for certain. He's still down there. And he still has my voice. Story 7. Low Gap isn't on the map anymore. I first heard about Low Gap from an old man at a gas station just south of the Smoky Mountains. I was on a solo road trip, taking a month off from work after my mother passed. No destination, just miles. I had been driving for days, sleeping in the back of my SUV or cheap motels, trying to outrun the kind of silence that follows grief. That morning, I stopped for gas and coffee, and the old man behind the counter noticed my hiking gear. He asked if I was looking for real quiet. I said, sure, why not? He told me about Low Gap, said it used to be a mining town, long abandoned, tucked up in the hills off a service road no one used anymore. You won't find it on GPS, he said. But if you take Route 15 up past the second switchback and watch for a stone mile marker with no numbers, there's a gravel path just beyond it. Follow that. It sounded made up like something from a local ghost story. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. That night, I camped in a forest pull-off and looked through all the paper maps I had in the glove box. None mentioned Low Gap. But I woke the next morning with one thought repeating in my head, like a whisper I didn't remember hearing. Go. So I did. The sky was overcast when I turned off Route 15, gravel crunching under my tires as the forest closed in on both sides. I had no idea I had already left the map behind. The gravel road narrowed quickly, trees leaning in from both sides like they were trying to reclaim it. I drove slowly, windows cracked to let in the cool air and bird song. But as I went deeper, the sounds began to fade. First, the birds, then the breeze. Soon it was just the crunch of tires on gravel and the hum of the engine. I passed no signs, no cabins, no signs of life at all. Then maybe a mile in, I saw it. An old wooden sign half swallowed by moss leaning against a tree. Faded letters carved into it read, Low Gap. The arrow underneath pointed ahead. I kept going, curiosity outweighing caution. After another 15 minutes of winding through thick forest, the road opened into a wide clearing. There it was. A cluster of old wooden buildings, some leaning, some half collapsed, all weathered by time. A church steeple stood crooked at the far end, its bell long gone. A general store with a rusted sign, houses with shattered windows and porches sagging under their own weight. I pulled the car into what used to be the town square and stepped out. The air smelled like damp wood and iron. I walked slowly through the silence. There were no animals, no wind, just the sound of my own boots against the packed earth. Then I noticed something strange. Every door in the town stood open, not kicked in, not broken, just open, wide enough for someone or something to step through. I called out, half expecting my own voice to echo. But it didn't. The sound seemed to die as soon as it left my lips. I turned to go back to the car, unsettled, only to find something new. There were fresh footprints in the gravel beside my driver's door, but they weren't mine. And I was sure they hadn't been there when I arrived. I stood frozen beside the car, staring at the footprints. They were too small to be mine, narrow and barefoot toes pressed deep into the gravel, like the person had been walking slowly, deliberately. They circled the vehicle once, then veered off toward the row of buildings on the north side of the square. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The town remained still, as if holding its breath. I told myself to leave, to get back in the car and drive out the way I came. But some part of me wanted answers. Maybe it was the grief, still fresh and raw, pushing me toward things I wouldn't normally chase. I followed the footprints past the shell of the old general store. Inside, the floor was warped dust, hanging in the air like fog. Shelves still stood, though most were empty. A few cans lined the back wall, labels faded beyond recognition. But what stopped me was the mirror, an antique thing with a cracked wooden frame hanging crooked above the counter. I caught my reflection and froze. Something was off. The store behind me looked darker in the glass, warped, as if the mirror showed the room in some other time or some other version of itself. And standing behind me in the reflection was a figure, small, barefoot. I spun around. No one was there. I stepped outside, heart pounding. The air felt heavier now, like the light itself had dimmed. Across the square, I noticed movement at the edge of the church. A door creaking shut. I crossed quickly, pushing it open, half expecting the building to be empty. But inside, the pews had all been pulled toward the center of the room, arranged in a spiral that faced inward. At the very center on the wooden floor was a small object, a photograph. I picked it up slowly. It was a picture of me standing outside the car, taken from above, like from a second-story window. But I hadn't seen any buildings with a second floor. Not yet. I backed away from the photograph, heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking. There was no explanation. No one else was supposed to be here. I hadn't passed a single car or person on the drive in. Yet here was proof that someone had not only seen me, but had been close enough to watch and photograph me. I shoved the picture into my jacket pocket and turned to leave the church. But the door I had entered through was now closed. I hadn't touched it. The air inside had changed. It felt warmer somehow, like body heat lingering in a room that had been still for too long. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling behind the altar. Slow, unhurried, like someone dragging their feet across the wooden floor. I called out, my voice unsteady, asking if someone was there. No response. Just the sound drawing closer. I stepped backward until my calves hit the nearest pew. From behind the altar, a figure emerged. Small, thin. A child, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Barefoot. Wearing clothes that looked wrong, too old, like they belonged to another time. The child stopped in the center of the spiral and tilted their head at me. I asked if they were okay, if they were lost. But they didn't speak, didn't blink, just raised one hand and pointed. Not at me, behind me. I turned slowly. On the back wall of the church, someone had painted a massive shape in thick black strokes. A door, but not like any door I had ever seen. It was tall and narrow and wrong, with no knob or hinges, just darkness painted where the entrance would be. Around it were dozens of handprints in faded red, all child-sized. When I looked back, the child was gone. So was the photograph in my pocket. And now from outside, I could hear footsteps circling the car again. This time, slower, closer, waiting. I didn't wait to find out who or what was outside. I rushed out of the church, slamming the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. The square was still empty, but something had changed. The sky above Low Gap had darkened unnaturally, the clouds thick and low, like they were pressing down on the town. The air was dense and buzzing, as if the silence itself had gained weight. I ran to the car, trying not to look at the open door of the general store or the windows of the houses that now all seemed to be watching. When I reached the car, I fumbled the keys, dropping them into the gravel before finally managing to unlock the door. As I climbed in, I felt it, that cold prickle along the back of my neck. I didn't look. I just started the engine. It turned over once, then stalled. Again, nothing. The third time, the engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse tires, spinning as I tore out of the square gravel spraying behind me. The road out of Low Gap felt longer than the road in. The forest pressed closer. Trees leaned in like they were trying to block the way. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of my headlights. At one point, I swore I saw the child again, standing beside a broken fence, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. I kept driving until I saw the stone mile marker and burst out onto Route 15 like I had just escaped a nightmare that refused to end. But even as the trees thinned and the road straightened, I knew Low Gap wasn't done with me. Not yet. I didn't stop driving until I was 2 towns over and the sky had cleared. I pulled into a diner parking lot and just sat there, hands still gripping the wheel long after the engine had cooled. Inside, everything felt normal. Waitresses pouring coffee, a radio playing low, someone laughing in a booth. But I couldn't stop shaking. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. That grief and isolation had warped something in my head. But that night in the motel room, I emptied my jacket pockets and found something I hadn't put there. A photograph, creased and damp. It was the same one from the church, the picture of me standing beside my car in Low Gap. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that painted door, the spiral of pews, the red handprints. I looked up the town the next day. Nothing. No listings. No historic mentions. Even the local ranger office said they'd never heard of it. I checked the road again a week later. Drove the same route, found the mile marker. But there was no gravel path, no clearing, just unbroken forest where the entrance had been. Sometimes at night, I hear gravel crunching outside my apartment window. Always slow, always circling. I've started keeping the photo in a drawer, face down. But even now, when I hold it in certain light, I swear something in the background has changed. The car is still there, the square, the buildings. But now, just inside the church doorway, a shadow is forming. And each time I look, it's closer. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.